You have power over your mind. Inner Steel, full YouTube script. They told him he would never walk again. He was 19 years old, lying flat on a hospital bed, paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident that should have ended everything. The doctors were kind about it. Gentle. They used words like permanent and irreversible and adjustment. They handed him pamphlets about wheelchairs and disability benefits and support groups, and they patted his hand like a man who needed comforting. But something strange happened in that hospital room. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling, and he made a decision so quiet, so still, that no one in that room even noticed it. He decided that his body was a problem. And problems, he believed, could be solved. His name was Rick Hansen. And 4 years later, he wheeled himself across Canada, 40,000 kilometers, through 13 countries, powered by nothing but his arms and a mind that refused to accept the story the world had written for him. That is not a story about a wheelchair. That is a story about who owns your mind. Because here is the truth that most people spend their entire lives running from. The one thing standing between you and every version of yourself you've ever wanted to become is not your circumstances, not your past, not the people who hurt you, not the job you didn't get, not the family you were born into. It is your mind. And your mind is yours. Completely. Unconditionally. Irrevocably yours. Nobody can take it. Nobody can buy it. Nobody can break it without your permission. If that sounds simple, it's because it is. But simple is not the same as easy. And that gap, between knowing something and living it, is where most men surrender without ever admitting they've surrendered at all. This is Inner Steel. And today, we're going inside the one battleground that decides everything else. Subscribe to Inner Steel right now. Every week, this channel goes deep into the philosophy and psychology of men who refuse to be ordinary. This is where that kind of thinking lives. The battlefield is inside. Before we go further, understand something. The ancient Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, they were not writing poetry. They were solving a problem. The problem was this: the world is chaotic, people are unreliable, luck is real, and suffering is guaranteed. Given those facts, how does a man build a life that cannot be destroyed? Their answer, arrived at independently across centuries and cultures, was always the same. You build it inside. You locate the one thing that belongs entirely to you, your judgment, your attention, your interpretation of events, and you make that thing unassailable. Epictetus was a slave. Literally owned by another man. Beaten. Humiliated. Stripped of every external freedom that most people take for granted. And yet he became one of the most respected philosophers of his age. When asked how a man could maintain dignity in chains, he said something so precise it still cuts. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. Not the things. The opinions about the things. The event is neutral. Your mind assigns meaning. And the meaning you assign determines your emotional experience, which determines your behavior, which determines your life. This is not motivational talk. This is the operating system. And once you understand how it works, you can never fully unsee it. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps including Auschwitz, described the same discovery in a way that stops men cold. He wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." He did not write that from a comfortable office. He wrote it from memory, reconstructing thoughts he'd formed while watching men die around him, while starving, while being worked to the edge of obliteration. And what he noticed, what kept him scientifically curious even in the darkest conditions imaginable, was that the men who survived longest were not always the physically strongest. They were the ones who maintained an interior life. They had something to think about. Something to hope for. Something that kept the mind active and upright when the body was failing. The battlefield is inside. It has always been inside. And your life right now is the current score of a war most people don't even know they're fighting. What surrender actually looks like. Here's the part nobody talks about. Surrender doesn't look like weakness. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a white flag. It arrives as comfort. It arrives as distraction. It arrives as the slow, quiet habit of letting your mind be occupied by whatever is loudest rather than whatever matters most. James Stockdale spent 7 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He was tortured repeatedly, kept in isolation, used as propaganda. His captors were methodical and patient. Their goal was not just to break his body, it was to break his mind, to make him doubt himself, to strip him of agency. And they very nearly succeeded. But Stockdale had read Epictetus. He had memorized passages from the Enchiridion, the handbook, while studying at Stanford years earlier. And in the darkness of a Vietnamese prison cell, with his hands behind his back and his legs in irons, he ran those passages through his mind the way another man might run his fingers over a compass. He knew where north was. He could feel it even in the dark. What he noticed about the men who broke, and some did break, was not cowardice. They were not weak men. They were men who had never trained their minds for this kind of weather. They had always outsourced their emotional state to their environment. When things were good, they felt good. When things were bad, they felt bad. That trade seems fine when life is comfortable. But the moment conditions turn brutal, it becomes catastrophic. Surrender, in the Stoic sense, is when you hand your mind over to something outside yourself. When you let the news decide how anxious you are. When you let another person's opinion determine your sense of worth. When you let your past control your present. When you let your circumstances determine what you believe is possible. That is not weakness. That is a habit. And habits can be broken. The first practice, choosing your interpretation. In 1914, Thomas Edison's laboratory, the place that housed decades of work, prototypes, patents, irreplaceable records, burned to the ground. The fire burned for hours. Edison was 67 years old. He stood watching his life's work turn to ash, and his son found him there, standing in the orange glow, calm. Eerily calm. Edison turned to his son and said, "Go get your mother and all her friends. They'll never see a fire like this again." The next morning, he walked through the ruins and said this: "There is great value in disaster. All our mistakes are burned up. Thank God we can start anew." 3 weeks later, his factory was operational again. Now, was Edison not human? Did he not feel the loss? Of course he did. This is not a story about suppressing emotion. It is a story about interpretation. Edison looked at the same event that would have crushed another man and asked a different question. Not, "Why did this happen to me?" but, "What can I build from here?" The question you ask in the moment of disaster determines everything that follows. And you get to choose the question. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the most powerful empire on earth while simultaneously fighting plagues and wars and betrayals, kept a private journal. It was never meant to be published. It was called the Meditations. And what you find in those pages is not a man declaring his strength. You find a man working, actively, daily, retraining his interpretations. Writing things like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wrote that to remind himself. Because even emperors drift. Even the most disciplined minds require maintenance. The practice of choosing your interpretation is never finished. It is a daily discipline, like sharpening a blade. Miss enough days and the edge is gone. Start today. When something goes wrong, and something will, catch the automatic interpretation before it solidifies. Ask, "Is this the only way to see this? What would a stronger version of me see here? What is the most useful meaning I could assign to this moment?" That question is a weapon. Learn to use it. The second practice, controlling your attention. William James, the father of American psychology, said something in 1890 that the entire modern tech industry has spent billions of dollars trying to make you forget. He said, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention, over and over again, is the very root of judgment, character, and will." The root. Not a contributing factor. the root. Where your attention goes, your life follows. This is not metaphor. It is neuroscience. The brain physically restructures itself around what you repeatedly attend to. Neurons that fire together wire together. You are, at this moment, becoming more of whatever you spend most of your time thinking about. In the summer of 1963, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend the next 27 years on Robben Island, a prison off the coast of Cape Town, where political prisoners were kept in small cells, forced to do hard labor, and subjected to deliberate dehumanization. The guards called him by his prisoner number. He was not allowed to read most books. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted. But Mandela controlled his attention. He studied. He exercised, push-ups, sit-ups, running in place in a cell barely large enough to stretch his arms. He learned Afrikaans, the language of his captors, because he understood that attention directed at understanding was more powerful than attention directed at hatred. He read whatever he could get his hands on. He thought carefully about the South Africa he intended to help build when he left. He did not allow his mind to live in the prison even when his body had no choice. When Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990, he was 71 years old. He had aged. But something in him had not aged at all. His attention had been on the future for 27 years. And his mind had gone there, quietly, every single day, while his body remained behind bars. Your attention is the most valuable resource you possess. More than money. More than time. Because attention is what makes time mean something. And right now, in the era of infinite distraction, controlling your attention is the most countercultural act available to you. Guard it like Mandela guarded his vision. Because what you attend to, you become. The third practice: separating what you control from what you don't. Epictetus built an entire philosophy on a single distinction. Some things are up to us. Some things are not up to us. Up to us, our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our judgments. These are ours completely. Nobody can reach inside and change them without our consent. Not up to us, our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, other people's opinions, the economy, the weather, death. He called this the dichotomy of control. And he was ruthless about it. He said, and this is not gentle, that if you confuse these two categories, if you treat things outside your control as though they belong to your inner world, you will suffer. Unnecessarily. Perpetually. You will be, in his words, a slave buffeted about, running after things that can never satisfy. Harsh. But watch what happens when a man actually applies it. In 2003, Bethany Hamilton was 13 years old and one of the most promising young surfers in Hawaii. On October 31st, she was lying on her surfboard in the early morning water when a 14-foot tiger shark took her left arm. She lost 60% of her blood. She nearly died. She was back in the water 26 days later. She couldn't control what happened. She couldn't control the shark, couldn't control the ocean, couldn't control the fact that she would spend the rest of her life with one arm. But she could control what she decided that fact meant. She could control whether she paddled back out. She could control the story she told herself about who she was. A year after the attack, she won her first national surfing title, competing against two armed surfers on the same ocean that had taken her arm. When people ask her how, she says this: I don't need easy. I just need possible. That is the dichotomy of control, lived out loud. Every morning, before the noise starts, run through your life with this filter. What is in your control today? Go there with full force. What is outside your control? Release it. Not because you're indifferent, but because pouring energy into things you cannot change is not noble. It is waste. And you are not here to waste. The fourth practice: refusing the stories that shrink you. Your mind is a story-making machine. It narrates constantly. It takes raw events and turns them into meaning, and that meaning becomes your identity, and your identity determines your ceiling. Most people never examine the stories. They inherit them, from parents, from failure, from rejection, from a single bad year that somehow became a permanent self-image, and they carry those stories into every room they enter, every relationship they build, every goal they approach. I'm not smart enough. I'm not the kind of person who does that. This is just who I am. These are not truths. They are stories. And stories can be rewritten. Roger Bannister spent the first 25 years of his life hearing the same story. 4 minutes. That was the wall. No human could run a mile in under 4 minutes. Doctors said the body would collapse. Physiologists published papers. Athletes who had come close confirmed it. There was something in the human frame that simply couldn't go faster. The story was so total, so universally accepted, that it had become fact in the public imagination. On May 6, 1954, at Oxford's Iffley Road track, Bannister ran the mile in 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. 6 weeks later, another runner broke his record. Within 3 years, 17 runners had done it. The physical barrier was never real. It was a story so widely believed that it had become a psychological cage for every runner on Earth. The moment Bannister broke the story, the cage opened. Not just for him. For everyone. What stories are you carrying that are not yours? What limits have you accepted because someone told them to you once, a long time ago, in a moment when they were not thinking clearly, and you were not old enough to argue? What would your life look like if you treated those stories not as facts but as the early drafts they actually are? Your mind wrote those stories. Your mind can rewrite them. That is not wishful thinking. That is the literal nature of neuroplasticity, the brain's documented, proven ability to form new pathways when exposed to new inputs and new patterns of thought. The story is not the wall. The story is the door. And you hold the key. The fifth practice. Using pain as information, not punishment. Most people run from pain. They numb it, avoid it, medicate it, distract themselves from it with noise and pleasure and busyness until the feeling passes. And it does pass. Until it doesn't. Until it accumulates into something so heavy that no amount of distraction can hold it back. The Stoics had a different relationship with pain. They called it the teacher. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. What blocks you guides you. What hurts you teaches you." David Goggins grew up in a household marked by poverty, abuse, and racism. He failed the Navy SEAL test. Failed again. His body, obese, damaged, exhausted, seemed to confirm every limitation his circumstances had already imposed. Every piece of external evidence said, this man cannot become what he wants to become. And in the gap between what the evidence said and what he chose to believe, Goggins found something he now calls the 40% rule. The idea that when your mind tells you that you're done, finished, empty, at the limit, you are actually at 40% of your true capacity. 60% remains. Untouched. Unlocked only by refusing to quit when everything screams stop. He went on to become one of the most decorated endurance athletes alive. He completed Hell Week 3 times. He set a pull-up world record, 4,030 in 17 hours. He ran ultramarathons through conditions that hospitalized other men. He did not do this because he was born special. He did this because he learned to read pain differently. Pain, for Goggins, stopped being a signal to stop. It became a signal that the work was real. That the growth was happening. That he was in the zone where most men retreat and the few move forward. You will feel pain. It is not optional. The only question is what you decide it means. Pain as punishment keeps you frozen. Pain as information moves you forward. The body is giving you data. The mind decides what to do with it. Start asking pain a different question. Not, why is this happening to me? But, what is this trying to show me? The answer, when you listen for it honestly, is almost always something you already knew but weren't ready to face. Pain is not your enemy. Avoidance of pain is your enemy. The willingness to feel it, sit with it, extract its intelligence and keep moving, that is where the real men are made. The sixth practice, training the mind like a muscle. Here is a mistake almost everyone makes. They treat mental strength as a personality trait. Something you either have or don't. They see a man who is calm under pressure, or decisive in chaos, or disciplined in comfort, and they think, he's just built that way. That's his nature. No. That is his training. The brain is not static. It is plastic. Malleable. Every thought you think, every reaction you choose, every moment of discipline or surrender, these are not just psychological events. They are biological events. They change the structure of the brain, incrementally, over time. The man who trains his mind daily for 10 years does not have the same brain as the man who spends those 10 years on passive consumption and reactive living. They are measurably, physiologically different. Miyamoto Musashi was the greatest samurai in Japanese history. He fought 61 duels and won every single one. In his later years, he withdrew from combat entirely and spent decades writing, painting, and practicing what he called the way of the warrior. His final work, The Book of Five Rings, written just days before his death, is not primarily about sword fighting. It is about the cultivation of mind. He wrote, "You must understand that there is more than one path to the top of the mountain." What he was teaching was this: the sword is an extension of the mind. A poor mind with a good sword is still a poor fighter. A trained mind with any instrument is dangerous. The weapon changes. The mind is the constant. He trained his perception, the ability to see situations clearly, without panic or wishful thinking. He trained his composure, the ability to remain still inside while external chaos raged. He trained his judgment, the ability to make clean decisions in moments that punished hesitation. These were not gifts. These were practices. And practices are available to everyone. Start with the small moments. Not the dramatic tests, those will come when they come. Start with the moment when you want to check your phone and you choose not to. Start with the moment when someone irritates you and you take 3 seconds before responding. Start with the early morning, before the world has a chance to invade, and give that time to your own thinking. Small disciplines, repeated, become permanent architecture. The man you are training to become is built in the ordinary moments that nobody sees. The seventh practice, anchoring to purpose. A man without purpose is at the mercy of his environment. He goes where the wind blows. He feels what the circumstances dictate. He reacts instead of choosing. Not because he's weak, but because he has nothing to steer toward. Purpose is not just motivation. It is orientation. It is the internal compass that tells the mind which direction is forward even when the ground is shifting. Ernest Shackleton led an Antarctic expedition in 1914 that became one of the greatest survival stories in human history. His ship, the Endurance, became trapped in pack ice and was slowly crushed. His entire crew, 28 men, was stranded on the ice, hundreds of miles from any human civilization, with no communication, no rescue knowledge, no guarantee anyone would ever come for them. What kept those men alive for 634 days on the ice was not luck. It was Shackleton's relentless orientation toward a single purpose: get every man home alive. Not most of them. All of them. That purpose structured every decision he made, every risk he calculated, every sacrifice he demanded of himself. He maintained morale through rituals, enforced mealtimes, sing-alongs, assigned jobs, communal routines, because he understood that purpose without structure collapses, and structure without purpose has no fuel. Together, they kept 28 men functional in conditions that should have broken them within weeks. All 28 men survived. Shackleton was asked later what the secret was. He talked about clarity. About knowing what you were for. About having an answer to the question, what is this all in service of? That was bigger than your current discomfort. Your purpose doesn't need to be grand. It doesn't need to appear in history books. But it needs to be real. It needs to be yours. And it needs to be something that makes suffering meaningful. Because suffering without meaning is just pain, and pain without meaning is the fastest road to collapse. Find what you're building. Find who you're building it for. Anchor to that. And when the weather turns, when it always turns, you will have something to hold on to that no external force can take away. The eighth practice, being honest about your own mind. This one is the hardest. It is far easier to be the hero of your own story than to look at yourself without flattery and see what's actually there. Most men who struggle with this, and most do, don't struggle because they're dishonest people. They struggle because the truth about themselves is uncomfortable, and the mind is very, very good at constructing comfortable fictions. You blame the economy, but you haven't updated your skills in 3 years. You blame your relationship, but you've never told your partner what you actually need. You blame your upbringing, but men with worse upbringings have built better lives. You tell yourself you'll start when conditions improve, but conditions have not improved in 5 years, and something in you already knows why. This is not cruelty. This is the most respectful thing that can be said to a man capable of more. Fyodor Dostoevsky spent 4 years in a Siberian labor camp after being arrested for political activity. He was led before a firing squad, the guns raised, the trigger pulled, and it was a mock execution, a last-minute reprieve designed to psychologically destroy him. Many men in his position were destroyed by it. They emerged from prison as shadows. Dostoevsky emerged transformed. He later wrote, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart." Fyodor Dostoevsky spent 4 years in a Siberian labor camp after being arrested for political activity. He was led before a firing squad, the guns raised, the trigger pulled, and it was a mock execution, a last-minute reprieve designed to psychologically destroy him. Many men in his position were destroyed by it. They emerged from prison as shadows. Dostoevsky emerged transformed. He later wrote, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart." But what changed him was not the suffering. It was what he chose to do with it. He turned the full force of his intelligence inward. He examined himself, his vanity, his arrogance, his desperate need for recognition, with the honesty that most men avoid their entire lives. And from that examination came the greatest novels in the Russian language. Crime and Punishment. The Brothers Karamazov. Works that still illuminate human psychology 150 years later. The man who cannot look at himself honestly is at the mercy of his own blind spots. He makes the same mistakes in different contexts. He attracts the same problems with different faces. He wonders why nothing changes. Sit with yourself. Ask the hard questions. Not to punish yourself. Punishment is not the goal. The goal is clarity. Because a man who sees himself clearly can change. A man who cannot see himself cannot. That is the most courageous act available to you right now. Not the mountain climb. Not the cold plunge. The honest, unflinching examination of your own mind. That is where real change begins. The ninth practice, committing without conditions. Conditional commitment is not commitment. It is a negotiation with the future, one that leaves an escape route open, an alibi ready, a reason prepared in case it doesn't work out. It feels like prudence. It is actually fear wearing the clothes of strategy. The man who says, "I'll go all in when I feel more ready," will never feel ready. The man who says, "I'll commit when I see evidence it's working," has it backwards. The commitment produces the evidence, not the other way around. The man who holds something in reserve, some part of himself back, just in case, will never know what he was actually capable of. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico with a small force, facing an empire. His men were afraid. Some wanted to return to Cuba. The odds were objectively terrible. And Cortés did something that has been discussed in military history ever since. He burned the ships. Not as metaphor. Literally. He ordered the fleet scuttled, destroying their only means of retreat. His men had one direction available to them now, forward. The option to quit had been physically removed from existence. Now, the conquest itself carries a brutal and complicated history that deserves its own reckoning. But the psychological principle Cortés applied that day is real, and it predates him by centuries and continues after him. When retreat is impossible, the mind's resources reallocate entirely toward advance. The energy that was split between, "Should I stay or go?" becomes unified, channeled, focused. You don't have to burn ships. But you do have to be honest about what you're holding in reserve. What are you keeping back? What escape routes have you quietly built into your commitments? What would it look like to close them? Because here is what is true: your mind is not capable of full output when it is simultaneously managing a retreat strategy. You can't run forward and backward at the same time. And the moment you close the back door, not recklessly, but deliberately, with full understanding of what you're choosing, something shifts. The mind gets serious in a way it cannot get while options remain. Commit. Without the conditions. Without the clause. With the full understanding that you may fail and that failure is acceptable, but retreat is not. That is when you find out what your mind is actually made of. The closing, the only war that matters. You have been watching this entire video. That means something. Not because sitting through a video is hard, it isn't. But because the things being said here are uncomfortable. And you stayed with them. That is not nothing. The ancient Stoics did not promise a life without pain. They did not offer comfort or ease or the guarantee that things would go your way. What they offered was something far more powerful, a self that could not be taken from you. A self built not on favorable conditions but on the daily, deliberate exercise of the one freedom no one can confiscate. Your mind. The men in this video, Frankl in the camps, Mandela in the cell, Shackleton on the ice, Stockdale in the dark, Hansen rolling across continents, Goggins at 40%, Bannister dismantling a lie the whole world believed. They were not superhuman. They were human. Completely, messily, vulnerably human. And they found, each in their own way, the same thing. That the war that matters is not out there. It is in here. The economy will do what it does. People will disappoint you. Luck will be uneven. The world is not designed to be fair, and it will not become fair because you want it to. These are facts. And none of them are the point. The point is what you do with your mind while all of that is happening. Today, not eventually. Not when things stabilize. Not when you feel ready. Right now, with whatever is in your life, whatever is broken, whatever is uncertain, what decision are you making about your mind? Because that decision is the only one that cannot be taken from you. And it is always available. If you found something real in this video, subscribe to Inner Steel right now. Every week we go deeper into the men who built unbreakable minds, the philosophies that forged them, and the practices that can forge yours. This is not entertainment. This is the work. You have power over your mind. Use it. Inner Steel.